Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
The morning mist hung over the forbidden forest like a living veil, silver gray and shifting, as though the very air had decided to dream. Salazar Slytherin stood at the boundary where manicured grass gave way to wild undergrowth, his emerald cloak heavy with dew that had gathered during his pre-dawn vigil. The castle behind him still slept, its windows dark save for the ever-burning torches in the entrance hall, but he had been standing here since the bells had chimed 3, waiting, listening, trying to understand what had been calling to him. It had begun 3 weeks ago, though if he was entirely honest with himself, and Salazar prided himself on unflinching self-awareness, perhaps it had begun much earlier. Perhaps it had begun the day they'd raised the last tower of Hogwarts and stood together, for friends united in triumph, watching the sun set over their completed dream. That was the day he'd first felt it, that subtle shift in the harmony between them, like a musical instrument slowly falling out of tune. The arguments had started small. Whether to admit students who showed accidental magic, but couldn't afford proper robes. How much of the old magic, the ritual magic, the blood magic, the deep magic that preceded wands, they should teach. What protections were sufficient for a school that housed children? Godric wanted to throw open the doors to anyone with a spark of magic in their veins. Rowena insisted on standards, on tests, on proving worthiness through intellect. Helga, dear Helga, wanted to nurture every seed regardless of how it might grow. And Salazar? Salazar heard the whispers in the walls, felt the ancient magic that saturated this land, and worried. He worried about the delicate balance they'd struck with the non-magical world. He worried about students who might abuse the power they were taught. He worried about the old families who watched their traditions being diluted, reformed, reshaped into something more palatable for modern sensibilities. Most of all, he worried about his friends, about the growing distances between them that no amount of late-night wine and reminiscence seemed to bridge. But 3 weeks ago, something had changed. He'd been walking the grounds in that gray hour before dawn when sleep eluded him, when the weight of unspoken concerns made his chambers feel like a tomb. He'd passed the greenhouses where Helga's medicinal herbs grew in neat rows, past the Quidditch pitch Godric had insisted on building, past the astronomical tower where Rowena charted the movements of celestial bodies. He'd walked without destination until he found himself here, at the forest's edge, and heard something. Not a sound, exactly. Sounds reached the ears, were processed by the mind, translated into meaning. This was something else entirely, something that bypassed all the normal channels of perception and spoke directly to the magical core that hummed in his chest. It was like hearing color, like tasting moonlight, like feeling the texture of time itself against his skin. The sensation was indescribable, though he'd filled 3 journals trying to capture it in words. It reminded him of the moment when a particularly complex spell clicked into place, when all the disparate elements suddenly aligned and magic flowed like water finding its course. But this was older, deeper, more fundamental than any spell he'd ever cast. This was magic before humans had decided to cage it in Latin phrases and precise wand movements. This was the song the earth itself sang when no one was listening. He'd returned every morning since, drawn by a compulsion he didn't fully understand. Each time, the sensation grew stronger, more distinct. He could almost parse meaning from it now, the way one might begin to understand a foreign language through immersion. There were patterns in the wordless music, rhythms that matched his heartbeat, harmonies that resonated with emotions he'd thought carefully buried. You're going to catch your death, standing out here in the damp. Salazar didn't flinch. He'd heard Helga approaching, her footsteps careful but not deliberately silent. She never could surprise him. He'd learned long ago to track the magical signatures of those around him, a habit born of younger years when trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Death has had numerous opportunities to claim me, he replied without turning. I doubt a bit of Scottish mist will succeed where poison daggers and dark curses failed. Helga moved to stand beside him, and he caught the scent of her, fresh bread and healing herbs, honey and comfort. She'd brought a second cloak, he realized, and was holding it out to him. Typical Helga, always caring for others even when they didn't ask for care. I'm quite warm enough, he said. Liar, she responded gently, but didn't press the cloak on him. Instead, she wrapped it around her own shoulders and stood with him, looking out at the forest. "You've been coming here every morning. The house elves are concerned." "The house elves are gossips," Salazar said, though there was no real heat in it. The castle's servants were perhaps the only beings who treated all four founders with equal devotion, caring nothing for the philosophical differences that divided them. "They care," Helga corrected. "As do I, Salazar. What draws you here? And don't tell me you're studying the growth patterns of highland flora. We both know you can barely tell a daisy from a dandelion." Despite himself, Salazar felt his lips quirk in what might almost have been a smile. "I'll have you know I can identify at least 7 varieties of poisonous plants. 8, if we count your attempts at cooking." This time he did smile, a brief flash that transformed his usually stern features. But the expression faded as he tried to find words for what he'd been experiencing. How could he explain something that existed beyond language? How could he describe a song that had no notes, a voice that spoke without words? "Do you ever feel," he began slowly, "that magic is trying to tell us something? Not through spells or rituals or any of the structured forms we've created, but directly? As though it has its own consciousness, its own desires, and we're all just translating badly." Helga was quiet for a long moment, and when he glanced at her, he saw she was truly considering his words, not just humoring him. "Sometimes," she admitted, "when I'm working with the plants, especially the magical ones, I feel like they're trying to communicate. Not in words, but in feelings, impressions. It's strongest with the older specimens, the ones that were here before we arrived." "Yes," Salazar breathed, relief flooding through him. "Yes, exactly. But this is more. Deeper. Helga, I think there's something in the forest. Not a creature, not a dark force, but a kind of magic we haven't encountered before. Or perhaps a very old kind we've forgotten." She studied his face, and he could see her natural curiosity warring with caution. "Have you told the others?" "And say what?" "That I'm hearing voices that aren't voices?" Godric would insist on charging in, sword drawn, ready to fight an enemy that doesn't exist. Rowena would want to study it, dissect it, transform mystery into theory. He shook his head. "Some things perhaps aren't meant to be understood through conventional means. But you want to understand it." It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. "I need to. There's something. I can't explain it, Helga, but I feel as though this is important. As though everything we're building here, all our grand plans for magical education, are missing something fundamental." Helga was quiet again, watching the mist begin to burn away as the first rays of sunlight touched the treetops. The forest looked less mysterious in the growing light, more like what it appeared to be, a collection of trees and undergrowth, home to creatures both magical and mundane. But Salazar could still feel it, that thrumming beneath the surface, that song without sound. "I could come with you," she offered, "if you're planning to investigate." "No." The refusal came out sharper than intended, and he softened his tone. "That is, I appreciate the offer, truly. But I think this is something I need to approach alone, at least at first. If there's danger, there's always danger, Salazar. That's never stopped any of us before. This is different." He struggled to articulate the certainty he felt. "This isn't about courage or caution. It's about receptivity, perhaps? About being open to something that might not reveal itself to a group, especially a group with such different approaches to magic." Helga looked like she wanted to argue, but the morning bell rang from the castle, its bronze voice carrying across the grounds. Soon, students would be stirring, preparing for another day of lessons. The ordinary world was reasserting itself, demanding attention. "Be careful," she said finally, squeezing his arm gently. "And Salazar, whatever you're hearing, whatever you find, you don't have to face it alone. We're still friends, despite the arguments. That hasn't changed." He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that everything was changing, that he could feel the bonds between them straining like overstretched leather. But she was already walking back toward the castle, her dawn shadow long across the grass, and the moment passed. Salazar remained at the forest's edge until the sun had fully risen, until he could no longer ignore his responsibilities. He had a class of third years to teach after breakfast, and then a meeting with the other founders about expanding the curriculum. Normal things, necessary things, but his mind remained with the wordless song, turning it over like a puzzle with no edges, no beginning, no end. That afternoon, he taught his students about the importance of intent in spellcasting, how the same words could produce vastly different results depending on the caster's emotional state and focus. Young Marcus Rosier asked why they needed words at all, if intent was what truly mattered, and Salazar had to pause before answering. Words give shape to intention, he said finally. They're containers for power, boundaries that prevent magic from spiraling beyond our control. Without them, he trailed off, remembering the sensation at the forest's edge, that wild, formless magic that seemed to exist in pure emotional state. Without words, what would magic become? What had it been before humans decided to tame it with language? Without them, sir? Marcus prompted. Without them, magic would be chaos, Salazar finished, but the words felt hollow, incomplete. Was it chaos, or was it something else entirely? Something they'd lost in their quest to categorize and control? That evening's founder meeting was tense, as they all were lately. Godric wanted to add more combat training to the curriculum, arguing that dark wizards wouldn't hesitate to attack students simply because they were young. Rowena countered that they were educators, not military trainers, and that focusing too heavily on defense would create paranoid, aggressive wizards. Helga suggested a compromise, optional defense clubs for those who wanted them, but Salazar could see none of them were truly satisfied. He contributed little to the discussion, his thoughts elsewhere. At one point, Rowena asked his opinion directly, and he had to ask her to repeat the question. Godric made some jest about Salazar communing with his serpents instead of participating, but there was an edge to the humor that hadn't been there a year ago. They parted without resolution, as was becoming common. Salazar returned to his chambers in the dungeons, but sleep eluded him. The wordless song seemed stronger at night, as though darkness removed some barrier between the ordinary world and whatever lay beneath. He could feel it thrumming through the castle's foundations, older than the stones they'd raised, older than the magic they taught. At midnight, he gave up the pretense of rest and made his way back outside. The castle was quiet, only the occasional ghost drifting through the corridors, and he encountered no one as he walked through the entrance hall and out onto the grounds. The forest looked different in moonlight, silver and shadow creating a landscape of possibility. Every tree could hide a secret, every shadow might conceal a revelation. Salazar stood at the boundary, gathering his courage, though he wouldn't have called it that. He was simply preparing himself, centering his magic, opening his mind to whatever awaited. Then he stepped across the threshold, from civilized ground to wild earth, and immediately felt the change. Inside the forest, the sensation was overwhelming. The wordless song didn't just whisper at the edges of his consciousness. It flooded through him like water through a broken dam. He staggered, one hand against a tree for support, as his magical core resonated with something vast and ancient and utterly foreign to everything he'd been taught. It wasn't dark magic. He knew the taste of that, the oily seductive pull of power without conscience. This was neither dark nor light, but something outside that simple binary. It was magic as the forest knew it, as the earth knew it, as the stones and streams and growing things knew it. It was connection without words, communication without language, understanding without explanation. His vision blurred, or perhaps expanded. The individual trees became part of a greater whole, their roots intertwined beneath the earth in a network of shared nutrients and information. The air itself seemed alive with invisible currents of power, flowing between living things like an eternal conversation. And underneath it all, supporting it all, was the song. No, not singular songs, plural. Hundreds of them, thousands, each unique but part of a greater harmony. The song of growth that pushed green shoots through frozen earth. The song of decay that returned all things to soil. The song of connection that bound predator to prey, parasite to host, seed to flower. They wove together in a complexity that should have been chaos, but was instead the most perfect music Salazar had ever experienced. He sank to his knees on the forest floor, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what he was perceiving. This was magic without the filters and restrictions of human understanding. This was the true face of power, beautiful and terrible, and completely beyond any attempt to control or contain. How long he knelt there, he couldn't say. Time seemed fluid in the forest, minutes stretching like hours or hours compressed into heartbeats. But gradually, like eyes adjusting to darkness, his consciousness adapted to the overwhelming input. He began to distinguish individual threads in the vast tapestry, to sense patterns in what had seemed like chaos. And that's when he heard it, a single voice among the multitude, speaking directly to him. Not speaking. That was the wrong word. It was more like recognition, as though the forest itself, or something within it, had noticed his presence and was acknowledging him. The sensation was like being seen, truly seen, for the first time in his life. All his carefully constructed walls, his serpent's cunning, his protective coldness, none of it mattered here. The forest saw through to his core, to the lonely child who'd learned to trust no one, to the young wizard who'd finally found friends only to feel them slipping away, to the man who heard music no one else could hear and feared he was going mad. "You are not mad, young serpent speaker." The words formed in his mind, but they weren't words, not really. They were impressions, understandings that his human consciousness translated into language, because that was the only way he could process them. You hear the old songs because you remember, in your blood and bone, what magic was before your kind caged it in words. This is rare among humans now. Most have forgotten how to listen. "Who are you?" Salazar whispered to the darkness, though he knew speaking aloud was unnecessary. "I am the guardian of this place, the keeper of its memories, the voice of its will. Your kind would call me a centaur, though that word captures only the shape, not the essence. I am Bane, and I have been waiting for one who could hear." A figure emerged from the shadows between trees, and Salazar's breath caught. He'd seen centaurs before, of course. They occasionally traded with the castle, exchanging prophecies and star charts for specific goods they couldn't produce themselves. But he'd never seen one like this. Bane was ancient, that much was immediately clear. Not old in the way humans aged, with weakness and decay, but ancient like the forest itself, having witnessed the turning of countless seasons without being diminished by them. His coat was the deep brown of fertile earth, marked with scars that looked like natural whorls in tree bark. His eyes held depths that spoke of stellar movements and cosmic patterns, of knowledge that predated human civilization. But it was his presence that was most overwhelming. Standing before Bane, Salazar felt the full weight of the forest's attention, as though every tree, every creature, every blade of grass was looking through the centaur's eyes. "You have been calling me," Salazar said, not a question but a realization. "The forest has been calling," Bane corrected, his voice like wind through autumn leaves. "I am merely its voice when words are needed. But you, Salazar Slytherin, you have the potential to hear without words, to understand without translation. This is why you were drawn here." "I don't understand." The admission hurt his pride, but there was no point in pretense here. "This magic, these songs, they're unlike anything in our texts, our traditions. How can they exist without our knowledge?" Bane's expression might have been amusement, though it was hard to tell. "Your texts are but a few centuries old. Your traditions reach back perhaps 1,000 years. The songs have existed since the first moment consciousness recognized itself in the universe. You cannot contain eternity in your libraries, young serpent." The centaur moved closer, and Salazar caught his scent, pine resin and starlight, morning dew and ancient wisdom. "But you could learn if you choose. You could remember what your kind has forgotten. The songs are not gone, merely sleeping, waiting for those brave enough to wake them." "Teach me," Salazar said immediately, the hunger for knowledge overriding caution. "I cannot teach what cannot be taught," Bane replied. "The songs must be discovered, not learned. They must be felt, not understood." "But," he paused, studying Salazar with those impossibly deep eyes, "there is a place where the veil is thinnest, where one of your sensitivity might rediscover what was lost. Beneath your castle, in the deep places where you laid the foundation stones, there is a cave that remembers." "Beneath Hogwarts?" Salazar's mind raced through his mental map of the castle. He knew every passage, every chamber, every secret his fellow founders had built into their creation. "There's nothing beneath the dungeons but solid rock." "There was something before there was nothing," Bane said cryptically. "Your castle was not built on empty land, wizard. Powers dwelt here long before you raised your towers, and powers remain that you have not discovered. The cave exists where silence itself was born, where the first song learned it did not need words." The centaur turned to leave, then paused. "But know this, Salazar Slytherin. The songs exact a price. They require absolute honesty of emotion, complete vulnerability of spirit. You who armor yourself in scales and venom, you who trust so carefully and so little, can you afford such a cost?" Before Salazar could respond, before he could ask the 1,000 questions burning in his mind, Bane had vanished into the forest as though he'd never been. Only the lingering sense of ancient presence suggested the encounter had been real and not some elaborate dream. Salazar stood slowly, his legs unsteady from kneeling so long on the cold ground. The forest around him seemed quieter now, though he could still feel the songs thrumming beneath the surface. They were fainter, as though Bane's departure had partially closed whatever door had been opened. But they were still there, still calling, still promising revelations that could change everything. He made his way back to the castle as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. His mind was already working through possibilities, searching his memory for any hint of a cave beneath the dungeons. The foundation stones had been laid with ritual and ceremony, the four founders working together to ensure the castle would stand for centuries. But had there been something there before? Something they'd built over without realizing? As he entered the castle, he encountered Rowena heading to the library for her customary early morning research. She took one look at him, his cloak damp with dew, forest debris in his hair, the slightly wild look in his eyes, and raised an elegant eyebrow. "Interesting evening, Salazar?" "Educational," he replied carefully. She studied him for a moment longer, and he could almost see her brilliant mind cataloging details, forming hypotheses. But she didn't press, simply nodded and continued on her way. That was Rowena's way. She gathered information patiently, waiting until she had enough pieces to see the full picture. Salazar returned to his chambers and sat at his desk, pulling out a fresh journal. He needed to document everything while it was still fresh: Bane's words, the sensation of the songs, the promise of a cave that might or might not exist. His quill moved across the parchment in his careful, precise script, capturing in inadequate words an experience that transcended language. As he wrote, he found himself thinking about the price Bane had mentioned: absolute honesty of emotion, complete vulnerability of spirit. The words were antithetical to everything he'd built his life around. From childhood, he'd learned that showing weakness invited attack, that trusting others led to betrayal, that the only safety lay in strength and secrets. But what if that was exactly why he could hear the songs when others couldn't? What if his very guardedness had made him sensitive to what lay beneath words, to the truths that couldn't be spoken? He'd spent so much of his life reading between lines, sensing hidden motivations, that perhaps he'd developed the ability to perceive communication that existed entirely outside conventional channels. The morning bell rang, calling the castle to breakfast. Salazar set down his quill and prepared to face another day of teaching, of meetings, of pretending everything was normal while revolution sang in his bones. But now he had a purpose, a direction. Somewhere beneath the castle, a cave waited. Somewhere in that cave, answers lingered. Or perhaps, he thought as he made his way to the great hall, not answers but better questions. Questions about the nature of magic itself, about what they were truly teaching their students, about what had been lost in the systematization of power. The songs continued their wordless whisper as he took his seat at the high table, surrounded by colleagues who couldn't hear them, teaching students who might never know they existed. But Salazar heard them, felt them, and knew his life had irrevocably changed. The keeper of silent songs had been awakened, and there was no returning to sleep. 3 nights passed before Salazar found the courage to search for the cave. He spent those nights in the dungeons, ostensibly reorganizing his private laboratory, but in truth he was mapping every stone, every passage, every forgotten corner of the castle's foundations. His wand traced patterns in the air, revealing magical signatures laid down during construction, searching for anomalies, for spaces that shouldn't exist, for gaps in the geometric perfection of Rowena's architectural spells. The dungeons were his domain in more ways than one. While the other founders had claimed towers and wings that reached toward sky and sunlight, Salazar had been drawn to the depths from the beginning. How terribly predictable, Godric had joked when Salazar chose the dungeons for Slytherin House. The serpent seeks his burrow. But it hadn't been about serpents or symbolism. Down here, in the embrace of stone and earth, Salazar could feel the bones of the castle, could sense the ancient magic that had soaked into the very bedrock over millennia. Now, with Bane's words echoing in his mind, he perceived the dungeons differently. Every shadow might conceal a passage, every cold draft might indicate a hidden space. He worked methodically, systematically, the way he approached all problems, with patience, precision, and an attention to detail that Rowena admired and Godric found maddening. On the 3rd night, he found it, not through magic, ironically, but through simple observation. He was standing in a rarely used corridor, one that led to old storage rooms they deemed too damp for anything valuable, when he noticed the temperature gradient. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but his years of working with potions had made him sensitive to such things. The air grew colder as he moved along the corridor, which was expected. They were deep underground, after all. But at one particular spot, marked by nothing more distinctive than a faded tapestry depicting intertwined serpents and badgers, the cold felt different. Older, deeper, as though it came not from the absence of warmth, but from the presence of something that had never known heat. The tapestry itself gave him pause. He recognized Helga's work in the patient detail of each scale, each fur tuft, the way the creatures seemed to move slightly in peripheral vision. But he didn't remember this tapestry, didn't recall discussing it or approving its placement. When had she hung it here? And why this design, serpents and badgers together, natural enemies in the wild, shown here in harmonious interaction? He pressed his palm against the stone behind the tapestry and immediately felt it, a resonance, like a tuning fork struck in a distant room. The stone was older than the rest, older than Hogwarts, older than any human construction. It remembered songs. "Show me," he whispered in Parseltongue, not really expecting a response. But the stone shivered under his touch, and he heard, no, felt, an answer. Not in Parseltongue, not in any language, but in that wordless communication he was beginning to recognize. The stone was waiting. It had been waiting for someone who could hear its silence. He thought of the morning in the forest, of the overwhelming sensation of the songs flooding through him, and tried to recreate that openness, that vulnerability. It was harder here, in the castle where he maintained so many masks, where even the walls knew him as the suspicious one, the careful one, the one who trusted last and least. But gradually, breath by breath, he let his defenses fall. The wall opened with a sigh that might have been relief, might have been welcome, might have been warning. Beyond was a passage unlike anything in the castle above. The walls were natural rock, unworked by human hands, smooth in places as though worn by the passage of water or centuries or both. Luminescent moss provided a faint blue-green glow, just enough to navigate by, and the air smelled of deep earth and something else, that wild honey and pine bark scent that had clung to Bane, the smell of magic that predated words. Salazar lit his wand from habit, but the light seemed wrong here, too harsh, too artificial. He extinguished it and let his eyes adjust to the moss glow. Better. This was not a place for the magic of control and command. This was a place for older truths. The passage descended in a gentle spiral, and with each step, Salazar felt the weight of the castle above him. Not oppressive but protective, like blankets on a winter night. The songs grew stronger as he descended, not louder but more present, as though he was walking into the heart of music itself. His magical core thrummed in response, a resonance that was almost painful in its intensity. Time became fluid in that descent. He might have walked for minutes or hours. The passage might have been 100 feet or 1,000. Reality seemed negotiable here, subject to laws older than physics. He thought of the old stories his grandmother had told, of heroes who descended into other worlds where a day lasted a year or a year passed in a heartbeat. He'd dismissed them as metaphor then. Now he wondered if they'd been simple truth. The passage opened suddenly into a vast cave, and Salazar stopped, his breath catching in wonder. The space was impossible. He knew the castle's dimensions, had helped calculate the load-bearing requirements of the foundations. There shouldn't be a cavern this large beneath Hogwarts without the entire structure collapsing. Yet here it was, stretching beyond the reach of the moss light, its ceiling lost in darkness above. The walls were decorated with natural formations that looked almost deliberate. Flowstone curtains that could have been frozen waterfalls, stalactites arranged in patterns that suggested meaning without revealing it. But what drew his attention, what made him move forward as though pulled by invisible threads, was the center of the cave. A pool of water lay there, perfectly circular, perfectly still. Its surface was black as polished obsidian, reflecting not the cave's ceiling but stars. Impossible stars that shouldn't exist this far underground. Stars arranged in patterns he didn't recognize. Stars that might have been from another sky entirely. Around the pool, stalagmites and stalactites had grown together over millennia to form natural pillars. There were 7 of them, and as Salazar approached, he could feel each one humming at a different frequency. Not sound but something deeper. Vibrations that his bones recognized, that his blood remembered, that his magic had been seeking without knowing what it sought. He knelt at the pool's edge, and his reflection looked back at him from the dark water. But it wasn't quite right. The face was his, but older, wearing expressions he'd never seen on his own features. Joy without reservation, sorrow without shame, love without fear. As he watched, the reflection multiplied, showing him dozens of versions of himself, hundreds, each slightly different. Salazars who had made different choices, walked different paths, become different men. And then the visions changed. He saw no, experienced the history of this place. Not in images, but in pure understanding that bypassed his eyes and spoke directly to his consciousness. This cave had existed before the land above knew human footsteps. It had been here when the world was younger, when magic was not yet separate from nature, when the first conscious beings discovered they could shape reality with will and desire. The first singers had gathered here. Not humans, not centaurs, not any race that still walked the earth. They were beings of pure magic, entities of consciousness and power who existed in the space between thought and form. They had no need for words because they were the words, the primal language that reality itself spoke. When they sang, mountains rose and fell. When they wept, oceans were born. When they loved, life sparked into being. But as ages passed, as the world grew more solid and defined, the first singers faded. They became echoes, memories, songs without singers. Yet in places like this cave, where the veil between what was and what is remained thin, their music lingered. Waiting, hoping, calling to those who might remember how to hear. Salazar understood now why he'd been drawn here, why the songs called to him specifically. It wasn't just his sensitivity or his secretive nature. It was his bloodline, not pure or impure, not magical or mundane, but old. Somewhere in his ancestry, far back beyond records or memory, one of the first singers had loved a human, had chosen to fade into flesh rather than dissipate into echo. That ancient heritage, diluted through countless generations, still carried a faint memory of what magic had been before humans learned to cage it in words. He extended his hand toward the water, not quite touching, and tried to empty himself of everything except emotion. It was the hardest thing he'd ever attempted. His mind wanted to analyze, categorize, understand. His defensive instincts screamed at him to maintain his walls, to protect his vulnerabilities. But the cave waited with infinite patience, and gradually, breath by breath, he let himself simply feel. Loneliness was the first emotion to surface, not the sharp, immediate loneliness of isolation, but the deep, existential loneliness of being fundamentally misunderstood. All his life, he'd seen things others missed, heard things others couldn't hear, feared things others dismissed. Even among wizards, even among his fellow founders, he was a part, different, other. The cave responded to his honesty. The 7 pillars began to resonate, each picking up a different harmonic of his emotion. The water rippled without being touched, and from those ripples rose something that wasn't quite light, wasn't quite sound, wasn't quite anything that had a name. It was visible emotion, tangible feeling, the loneliness given form and substance. It coiled around him like one of his serpent familiars, but made of pure sensation rather than scale and muscle. And in that moment, wrapped in his own acknowledged isolation, something extraordinary happened. The loneliness transformed. It became not a wall that separated him from others, but a bridge that could connect him to anyone who had ever felt alone. It became compassion. The realization hit him with physical force. This was what the songs truly were, not spells or enchantments, but pure emotional alchemy. When emotion was expressed with absolute honesty, without pretense or defense, it transformed into magic. Not the magic of imposed will that wizards practiced, but the magic of connection, of recognition, of shared experience made manifest. He experimented through the night, discovering different songs hidden within different emotions. His fierce protectiveness toward his students became a shielding song that created barriers of shimmering air. His deep curiosity about the nature of magic became a song of revelation that showed hidden patterns in the stone around him. His carefully suppressed affection for his fellow founders became a warming song that banished the cave's ancient chill. But with each song came a cost, just as Bane had warned. To create the shield, he had to acknowledge how much he truly cared about others' safety, how much their well-being mattered to him despite his cold exterior. To sing Revelation, he had to admit his desperate hunger for knowledge, the way it consumed him, drove him, sometimes blinded him to human concerns. To bring warmth, he had to face his love for Godric, Rowena, and Helga, love that terrified him because it made him vulnerable, gave them power to hurt him in ways no enemy could match. As dawn approached somewhere far above, Salazar sat exhausted by the pool, his emotional reserves depleted, his carefully maintained facades in ruins around him. He felt raw, exposed, newborn. He also felt more genuinely himself than he had in years, perhaps ever. That's when he noticed the writing. Carved into a flat stone near the pool's edge, so faint he'd missed it in his earlier exploration, were words in a script that predated even ancient runes. He had to lean close to make them out, and even then, understanding came more through the songs than through his eyes. Those who sing in silence must choose, share the song and risk its corruption, or keep the song and risk corruption of self. Below this, in different hands from different times, were other inscriptions, notes left by those who had found this place before him. Some were in languages he recognized, others in scripts that might have been from civilizations that fell before history began. But he could understand them all through the emotional resonance that clung to the carved words. I chose silence. It devoured me from within. And signed, but the despair still echoed in the stone. We shared with the unworthy. The songs became weapons. The bloodshed continues. In what looked like ancient Greek, though older than any Greek he'd studied. The children learned too young. Their emotions unmade them. In primitive runes, heavy with regret. Balance exists between sharing and secret. Find the worthy. Trust the wise. In a language that might have been the root of Latin, hopeful despite everything. Salazar traced each inscription with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of history, the burden of repeated failure. Everyone who had discovered the songs faced the same terrible choice. Share them and risk catastrophe. Hide them and risk madness. Was there truly no middle path? He thought of his fellow founders, of the students sleeping peacefully in the castle above. What would Godric do with the power to weaponize courage itself? What would Rowena discover if she could dissect the fundamental nature of emotion? What would Helga heal if she could touch hearts directly? The possibilities were wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. But what would happen to him if he kept this secret? Already he could feel the songs changing him, making him more aware of the emotions around him, more sensitive to the unspoken truths that everyone carried. In the few hours since he'd entered the cave, he'd experienced more genuine emotion than in the past several years. Could he return to his masks, his careful distances, his protective coldness? Or would the attempt to suppress the songs tear him apart from within? He stood slowly, muscles stiff from sitting on cold stone, and made his way to one of the pillars. Up close, he could see it was covered in tiny crystals that caught and reflected the moss light. When he touched it, he felt the accumulated emotions of everyone who had ever stood in this cave, joy and sorrow, hope and despair, love and loneliness, all woven together into something that was almost unbearably beautiful. This was the true treasure of the cave, he realized. Not the ability to sing silent songs, but the proof that all beings who felt were connected. Every emotion that had ever been truly experienced lived on here, adding to the grand symphony that played beneath the surface of reality. He was not alone, had never been alone, could never be alone as long as he could feel. The revelation brought tears to his eyes. Him, Salazar Slytherin, who hadn't cried since childhood, who prided himself on control and composure. But here, in this place of ultimate honesty, tears were not weakness but strength, not surrender but victory. He left the cave as the castle bells announced the dawn, climbing back through the spiral passage with new understanding weighing on his shoulders. The wall sealed behind him with a whisper that might have been return, might have been remember, might have been choose. The tapestry looked exactly as it had before, serpents and badgers intertwined, Helga's patient work in every thread. But now he saw what he'd missed. The creatures weren't just intertwined, they were protecting each other. The serpent's coils shielded the badger from unseen danger above, while the badger's solid presence guarded the serpent's vulnerable underbelly. Together, they were stronger than either alone. Was that Helga's message? Had she known about the cave, about the songs? Or was it simply her intuitive understanding that cooperation was always stronger than isolation? He made his way back to his chambers, grateful that the early hour meant empty corridors. He needed time to think, to process, to decide. But as he reached his door, he found someone waiting for him. Rowena stood there, still in her nightrobe though covered by a heavy cloak, her dark hair uncharacteristically loose around her shoulders. She looked at him, at his disheveled appearance, his red-rimmed eyes, the fundamental change that he couldn't quite hide, and her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Salazar," she said softly, "what have you found?" He could have lied, could have deflected, could have retreated behind his usual walls of sarcasm and secrets. But the song still thrummed in his blood, and he could feel her genuine worry, her deep care that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with friendship. "Something wonderful," he said, his voice hoarse from the night's emotional extremes. "Something terrible. Something that could change everything or destroy everything, and I don't know which." She stepped closer, and he saw that she was prepared to listen, not as Rowena the scholar who hungered for knowledge, but as Rowena his friend who had stood beside him through the founding of Hogwarts, through battles with dark wizards, through the thousand small miracles and catastrophes of creating a school. "Show me," she said, and it wasn't a demand but an offer. An offer to share the burden, to help carry the weight of whatever he'd discovered. Salazar looked at her for a long moment, remembering the inscriptions in the cave, the warnings of those who had chosen to share unwisely. But he also remembered the equal warnings of those who had chosen silence and been destroyed by it. And he remembered the last inscription, the one that spoke of balance, of finding the worthy, of trusting the wise. If anyone was worthy, it was Rowena. If anyone was wise enough to understand the implications, it was her. Not here, he said finally. And not just you. If I'm going to share this, all four of us need to know. All four of us need to choose. She nodded, accepting his terms without argument. Tonight then? After the students are abed? Tonight, he agreed. In my study. And Rowena, bring an open mind. What I have to show you doesn't fit into any magical theory we know. The best discoveries never do, she said with a small smile. Then more seriously, whatever it is, Salazar, we'll face it together. That's what we promised when we founded this place. United we stand. She left him then, returning to her tower, and Salazar entered his chambers with her words echoing in his mind. United we stand. But what if unity wasn't enough? What if the very thing that could unite them more deeply than ever before was also what would ultimately divide them? He sat at his desk and pulled out a fresh journal, beginning to document everything he'd experienced in the cave. The words felt inadequate, trying to capture the wordless, but he persisted. If nothing else, there should be a record. If they chose wrong, if catastrophe followed, someone should know what they'd attempted and why. As he wrote, he became aware of subtle changes in his perception. He could sense the emotional states of people passing in the corridor outside, a student's anxiety about an upcoming exam, a house elf's simple contentment in its work, a ghost's eternal melancholy. The songs had awakened something in him that couldn't be put back to sleep. He paused in his writing, quill suspended above parchment, as a thought struck him. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the choice wasn't really about sharing or secrecy, but about acceptance or denial. The songs existed whether wizards acknowledged them or not. The question was whether they would learn to work with this deeper magic or continue to ignore it, imposing their will on a reality that was far more complex than their spells acknowledged. Through his window, he could see students beginning to move about the grounds, early risers taking advantage of the dawn hours for flying practice or private study. They looked so young from here, so full of potential, so unaware of the deeper currents that moved through the world. Was it kindness to protect them from that knowledge, or cruelty to deny them the full truth of magic? He didn't have an answer. But tonight, with his fellow founders, he would begin to search for one. The quill moved across the page, recording words that tried to capture wordlessness, describing songs that needed no voice. And deep beneath the castle, in a cave that existed outside ordinary space, the pool of impossible stars rippled once, as though in approval or warning or simple acknowledgement that the choice, once again, was being made. The keeper of silent songs had found what he sought. Now came the harder task, deciding what to do with it. The four founders gathered in Salazar's private study as the castle settled into its nighttime quiet. Outside, a storm was building over the Scottish Highlands, wind rattling the windows with fingers of coming rain. It seemed fitting, Salazar thought, that nature itself should mark this moment with drama. His study was unlike the common rooms where they usually met. This was his sanctuary, his most private space, and the others entered it with the slight hesitation of guests who knew they were being granted a rare privilege. The walls were lined with preserved specimens in crystal jars, not dark artifacts as some students whispered, but botanical samples, shed snake skins, crystallized venom that caught the candlelight like deadly jewels. His desk was obsidian, a gift from a grateful parent whose child he'd saved from a poorly brewed poison. The chairs were comfortable but not soft, encouraging alertness rather than relaxation. Godric entered first, as he always did, claiming space with his mere presence. He wore his sword even here, even among friends, because that was Godric's way, always ready for battle, even when none threatened. His red hair caught the firelight as he sprawled in one of the chairs with characteristic informality, but Salazar could see the tension in his shoulders, the wariness in his blue eyes. Godric knew something significant was coming. Rowena arrived precisely on time, not a moment early or late, carrying a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained note-taking materials. She had changed from her nightrobe into proper robes of midnight blue, her dark hair now bound in its usual intricate braids. She took the chair nearest the window, where the lightning would provide additional illumination for whatever they were about to witness. Helga came last, and she brought tea. "I thought we might need it," she said simply, setting the tray on a side table. The pot steamed with the scent of chamomile and honey, with something else, Valerian root, Salazar recognized, for calm and clarity. Trust Helga to think of their comfort, even in moments of high significance. She took the remaining chair, completing their circle, and for a moment they all simply sat, looking at each other. These were the people who had built a school from dreams and determination, who had faced dark wizards and political pressure, who had argued and reconciled 1,000 times over. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a threshold. "Well," Godric said finally, because patience had never been his strength, "are you going to tell us why we're gathered in your sanctum, Salazar, or shall we spend the evening trying to guess?" "I vote for ancient curse. Rowena thinks you've discovered a new branch of magic. Helga's worried you're ill." "I'm not ill," Salazar said, then paused. "At least, not in any conventional sense." "That's reassuring," Godric muttered, but there was genuine concern beneath the sarcasm. Salazar stood and moved to the window, watching the storm clouds gather. How to begin? How to explain something that existed beyond explanation? He could feel the songs humming in his blood, stronger now than they'd been this morning. Every emotion in the room was tangible to him. Godric's protective worry, Rowena's burning curiosity, Helga's patient love. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrible all at once. 3 weeks ago, he began, still facing the window, I started hearing something. Not voices, not exactly, but a call. A song without words, a music without sound. I thought I was going mad. "You're not," Helga said immediately, with such certainty that he turned to look at her. "You've heard them too?" "Not heard, exactly. But sometimes when I'm working with the older magical plants, especially the ones that were here before we arrived, I feel something. Like they're trying to communicate in a language that predates words." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I thought it was just my imagination." "It's not," Salazar said. "It's real. And last night, I found where it comes from." He told them about the morning meetings with the forest, about Bane and his cryptic guidance, about the search through the dungeons. When he described finding the cave entrance behind Helga's tapestry, she made a small sound of recognition. "I didn't hang that tapestry," she said quietly. "It was already there when we built the castle. I thought one of you had placed it, some old family heirloom perhaps. It seemed protective somehow, like it was guarding something. So I reinforced it with preservation charms, but left it otherwise untouched." "Guarding indeed," Salazar agreed. "Behind it lies a passage to a cave that shouldn't exist, that predates human presence on this land, that contains magic older than any we've studied." He described the cave, the pool of impossible stars, the 7 pillars that resonated with emotion. He told them about the history he'd experienced there, the first singers who had shaped reality with pure feeling. He explained the transformation of emotion into magic, the songs that required no words, the price of absolute honesty they demanded. Through it all, his friends listened without interruption, though he could see questions building behind Rowena's eyes, see Godric's hand tightening on his sword hilt, see Helga's expression cycling through wonder and worry. "Show us," Rowena said when he finished. "Words aren't enough for this. We need to experience it." Salazar had expected this, had prepared for it, but still he hesitated. Once they knew, once they felt the songs, there would be no going back. They would all be changed as he had been changed. Was he right to burden them with this knowledge? "The inscriptions in the cave," he said slowly, "left by others who discovered the songs, they all tell of disaster. Sharing that went wrong. Secrets that destroyed from within. There's danger in this knowledge." "There's danger in all knowledge," Rowena countered. "That's never stopped us before. This is different. This isn't just learning a new spell or discovering a new potion. This changes how you perceive everything, everyone. You'll never be able to not feel what others feel. You'll never be able to fully rebuild the walls between yourself and the world." "Walls," Godric said thoughtfully, and it was rare to hear that tone from him, contemplative rather than decisive. "Is that what we're doing, Salazar? Building walls? I thought we were building bridges. Bridges between the magical and mundane worlds, bridges between tradition and innovation, bridges between the old families and the new magic users." "Pretty bridges with strong walls to guard them," Salazar replied, old argument rising. "Protection isn't isolation, Godric. It's wisdom." "And yet," Helga interjected gently, "the wisest protection might be understanding. If these songs teach us to truly feel what others feel, how can that be anything but good? Empathy is never a weakness." "Empathy without boundaries is drowning," Salazar said. "Trust me, I've spent the day feeling every emotion that passes through these halls. Every student's homesickness, every teacher's frustration, every ghost's eternal sorrow. It's overwhelming. Then teach us to swim, Godric said simply. That's what we do, isn't it? Face the overwhelming and find a way through. Salazar looked at each of them, these people who had become, despite his best efforts at maintaining distance, his family. He thought of the inscriptions in the cave, the warnings and failures. But he also thought of the last inscription, the one that spoke of balance, of finding the worthy. If anyone was worthy, it was these three. Very well, he said, but not here. The cave itself is part of the experience. And, he hesitated, then forged ahead. You'll need to leave your wands. The songs don't work with the magic of control. They require vulnerability. Godric's eyebrows shot up. Leave our wands? Salazar, that's necessary, Salazar interrupted. I know how it sounds. But trust me, as I'm trusting you. The cave won't harm us. It can't. It's not that kind of magic. They looked at each other, these four who had faced so much together, and one by one they nodded. Trust, after all, was the foundation of their friendship, even when that foundation had been strained lately. They made their way through the sleeping castle like conspirators or thieves, moving through shadows and secret passages to avoid the patrolling ghosts and wakeful portraits. The storm had broken while they talked, and rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury, thunder rolling across the highlands like divine commentary. At the tapestry they paused. Lightning illuminated the corridor through a high window, casting the woven serpents and badgers into sharp relief. They seemed to move in that flickering light, seemed almost alive. Together, Helga said, studying her own work, or what she'd thought was her work. That's what it's showing, isn't it? Not just coexistence, but cooperation. The serpent and badger protecting each other. Protecting what's behind them, Salazar corrected softly, pressing his hand to the hidden stone. This time, he didn't need to speak, didn't need to consciously open himself. The cave recognized him, welcomed him. The wall opened with that same sound of patient acceptance. Merlin's beard, Godric breathed, peering into the phosphorescent passage. How did we not know this was here? Because it wasn't meant to be found by chance, Rowena said, already analyzing. The magic here is different, older. It exists alongside our constructed reality, rather than within it. They descended single file, Salazar leading, the others following with varying degrees of wonder and wariness. The moss light seemed brighter tonight, as though responding to the presence of multiple magical beings. Or perhaps, Salazar thought, responding to the emotional intensity of the moment. When they emerged into the cave proper, he heard their collective intake of breath. Even Rowena, who prided herself on rational response to all phenomena, stood speechless before the impossible space. The storm above couldn't be heard here, but something of its energy seemed to have followed them down, making the air feel charged with potential. The stars, Helga whispered, moving toward the pool. They're not our stars, are they? I don't think they're stars at all, Rowena said, kneeling beside her. They're possibilities, potentials, places where reality could be different. They're songs, Salazar said simply. Each one is an emotion that was felt here, transformed into light, preserved in reflection. The pool remembers everything. Godric had approached one of the 7 pillars, reaching out to touch it, then pulling his hand back. I can feel it, he said, wonder in his voice. Like standing next to a lightning strike, but warm, welcoming. Each pillar resonates with a different aspect of emotion, Salazar explained. Joy, sorrow, fear, love, anger, hope, and... He paused at the 7th pillar, understanding. That one's the hardest to hear, but the most important. How do we begin? Rowena asked, and there was an eagerness in her voice that reminded Salazar why he'd fallen half in love with her years ago. That pure hunger for knowledge, that fearless pursuit of truth. You feel, he said. Completely. Honestly. Without reservation. Let me show you. He moved to the center of the cave, equidistant from all 7 pillars, and closed his eyes. The songs were so much stronger now, with his fellow founders present, their emotions adding to the symphony. He could feel their individual notes, Godric's courage underscored with doubt, Rowena's curiosity tinged with apprehension, Helga's love shadowed by fear of loss, and his own emotions, no longer hidden, no longer contained. He let his affection for them flow freely, and the cave responded. Light bloomed from the pillars, not harsh but warm like summer sunshine. The air filled with that scent of wild honey and pine, but also with other fragrances, Godric's favorite whiskey, Rowena's ink and parchment, Helga's fresh bread. The temperature rose until the cave felt like a comfortable common room rather than underground stone. And through it all, the wordless song wrapped around them, carrying the message more clearly than any words could. You are valued. You are seen. You are loved. When he opened his eyes, he saw tears on Helga's face, saw Godric standing stunned and open-mouthed, saw Rowena pressing her hand to her chest as though trying to contain something too large for her body. You felt that, Godric said, not a question but a revelation. You actually feel that way about us. Despite all our arguments, all our differences. Because of them, Salazar corrected. Your differences make you who you are. Even when you frustrate me, even when we disagree, you're mine. He struggled for the word, then gave up and let the emotion speak for itself. The song swelled, carrying nuances no language could capture. The fierce protectiveness of family, the deep respect of equals, the complicated love that came from truly knowing someone. "Oh, Salazar," Helga said, and crossed to embrace him. He stiffened for a moment. Physical affection had never been easy for him, then relaxed into it, feeling her own emotional song wrapping around him like the warmest of blankets. Safety, acceptance, unconditional love. "This is incredible," Rowena breathed, turning in a slow circle, observing how the cave responded to their emotional states. The applications, the implications, we could revolutionize magical education. Imagine teaching empathy directly. Imagine healing emotional wounds as easily as physical ones. Imagine weapons, Salazar interrupted gently, pulling back from Helga's embrace. Imagine someone projecting pure terror, pure despair, pure hatred with this intensity. Imagine children exposed to adult emotions without filters or boundaries. Imagine the ambitious using manufactured love to create slaves more thoroughly bound than any imperious curse. The light in the cave dimmed as the implications sank in. "There are defenses, surely," Godric said, but his usual confidence was shaken. "Ways to protect against emotional manipulation." "Are there?" Salazar moved to the wall where the inscriptions waited. "Look at what those before us wrote. Look at their failures." They gathered around the ancient warnings, and he watched their expressions change as they read. Even through different languages, different scripts, the emotional resonance of the words was clear. Despair, regret, horror at what had been unleashed. "But there's this one," Helga said, pointing to the last inscription. "Balance between sharing and secret. Find the worthy. Trust the wise." They found a middle path. "Or they hoped one existed," Rowena said. "Hope isn't the same as success." They stood in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of decision. The cave waited around them, patient as stone, eternal as emotion itself. "We need time," Godric said finally. "Time to understand this properly, to explore safely, to make an informed decision." "Agreed," Rowena said. "We should study this systematically. Test the boundaries, understand the mechanisms, document everything. Knowledge without understanding is just another form of ignorance." "But carefully," Helga added. "And together. No one explores alone. No one pushes too far without the others present. We protect each other." Salazar felt a rush of relief, so strong it made the pillars hum. "You're not afraid?" "Terrified," Godric admitted with a grin that was only slightly forced. "But when has that ever stopped us? We built a school for magic on a Scottish mountain. We convinced the ministry to leave us alone. We united for houses that should be at each other's throats. We're rather good at impossible things. And this," Rowena added, her eyes bright with possibility, "this could be the key to everything we've been trying to achieve. True understanding between wizards and muggles. Genuine unity between the houses. Real comprehension of magic itself. Or our destruction," Salazar felt compelled to point out. "Most worthwhile things carry that risk," Helga said philosophically. "Love, trust, friendship, they all make us vulnerable. But imagine living without them." They spent the rest of the night in the cave, cautiously exploring the songs. Godric discovered he could project courage so powerfully it could break through paralyzing fear. Rowena found that her song of understanding could transfer complete knowledge from one mind to another. Not just facts but context, meaning, the full weight of comprehension. Helga's healing songs didn't just mend bodies, but could ease emotional wounds that had festered for years. And together, when they combined their songs, they created something extraordinary. A harmony that made the cave itself sing, that turned the pool into a mirror of pure light, that for one perfect moment showed them what humanity could become if everyone could truly feel what others felt. But they also discovered the dangers. When Godric's righteous anger flared at a remembered injustice, the cave's temperature spiked dangerously. When Rowena pushed too hard for understanding, She nearly lost herself in the flood of information from centuries of stored emotion. When Helga tried to heal too much at once, she collapsed from the effort, and they had to carry her back to the castle. As dawn approached, it was always dawn when significant things ended, Salazar noted. They made their way back through the passage, exhausted but exhilarated. The storm had passed, leaving the castle washed clean, and early sunlight sparkled on wet stone. "We tell no one else," Rowena said as they stood in the corridor, the tapestry hiding the cave once more. "Not until we understand it better." "Agreed," the others said in unison. "We meet every week," Helga added, recovered but still pale. "Together. We learn, we practice, we decide. And we protect each other," Godric said firmly. "From the songs, from ourselves, from anyone who might abuse this knowledge." Salazar looked at his friends, tired, changed, but unbroken, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the fragile hope of wishes and dreams, but the solid hope that came from facing fear together and not running. "There's one more thing," he said reluctantly. "Now that you've been in the cave, now that you've felt the songs, you'll never completely stop hearing them. They become part of you. Every strong emotion around you will be tangible. Every lie will ring false. Every hidden pain will call out to be healed." They absorbed this in silence, understanding the magnitude of the change. "Then we'd best learn to use it wisely," Rowena said with determined practicality. "And to help each other when it becomes too much," Helga added. "And to find the humor in it," Godric said with a slightly manic grin. "Imagine knowing exactly when someone's lying about liking your haircut." Despite everything, they laughed. It was tired laughter, tinged with hysteria, but it was real. And in that moment, Salazar felt their emotional songs align, creating a harmony that suggested, just maybe, they could handle this responsibility. As they separated to return to their quarters, to prepare for a day of teaching with new awareness flooding their senses, Salazar caught Rowena's arm. "Thank you," he said simply, "for believing me, for trusting me." She looked at him with those dark, penetrating eyes, and he could feel her emotional song, complex as a symphony, brilliant as starlight, touched now with something deeper than intellectual curiosity. "We're going to change the world," she said softly, "or destroy it. Either way, I'm glad we're doing it together." She squeezed his hand and left, and Salazar stood alone in the corridor, feeling the weight of what they'd begun. In the cave below, the pool of impossible stars rippled once, twice, then grew still. The songs continued their wordless whisper, patient as stone, eternal as emotion. The secret was shared. The burden was distributed. The true test was about to begin. 6 months passed like water through cupped hands, too quickly to hold, leaving only the memory of its passing. The 4 founders had become masters of deception, though not by choice. Every week, they met in the cave of first silence, learning to navigate the overwhelming world of emotional magic. Every week, they returned to the castle changed a little more, seeing a little deeper, feeling a little stronger. And every week, they had to pretend that nothing was different. It was hardest during staff meetings. Professor Aldrich would drone on about curriculum changes, while nursing a secret resentment toward Godric that tasted like spoiled milk in the emotional atmosphere. Professor Montague would smile and agree with Rowena's proposals while her jealousy burned green as poison. The other teachers, good people all, carried their hidden pains and secret joys like invisible wounds and treasures, and the 4 founders felt them all. "We have to tell them," Godric argued after a particularly difficult meeting where he'd nearly responded to an insult Aldrich had only thought, not spoken. They were in the cave, their weekly sanctuary, and his frustration made the red pillar pulse like a heartbeat. "This deception is eating at us. Can't you feel it?" They could. The weight of the secret was creating a distance between them and the rest of the staff, a barrier that grew thicker with each passing day. Students had begun to notice that the 4 founders seemed somehow separate, conferring in whispers, disappearing together at odd hours. "Tell them what?" Salazar countered from his position by the pool of stars. "That we can feel their every emotion? That we know their secrets without trying? That we've discovered a form of magic that could revolutionize or destroy everything we've built?" "Tell them the truth," Godric said stubbornly. "Trust them as we trust each other." "Trust must be earned," Rowena interjected from where she sat surrounded by crystal tablets, documenting their discoveries in a script she'd invented specifically for this purpose. One that could only be read by someone who could feel the emotional resonance she'd embedded in each symbol. "We've had months to adjust to this, and we still struggle. Imagine dropping this knowledge on someone unprepared." Helga said nothing, but her emotional song spoke volumes. She was torn, as she always was these days, between her natural inclination to share and nurture, and her growing understanding of how dangerous the songs could be. Just last week, she'd accidentally projected her grief over a student's family tragedy so powerfully that 3 house elves had collapsed in tears. "We need guidelines," she said finally. "Rules for how to use this knowledge, protections for those who might learn it, safeguards against abuse." "I've been working on that," Rowena said, gesturing to her tablets. "A complete system of emotional magic, its principles, its applications, its dangers. If we're going to share this eventually, we need to be able to teach it properly. And I've been developing defenses," Salazar added quietly. "Ways to shield against emotional projection, to maintain boundaries, even while feeling others' songs." They all turned to look at him, and he felt their surprise like a cool wind. He'd been working alone. "Without telling them? You said we do everything together." Godric's voice carried hurt beneath the anger. "Some things are too dangerous to explore together," Salazar replied, not meeting their eyes. "The darker applications of the songs, someone needs to understand them, to know how to counter them, but I didn't want to burden all of you with that knowledge." "Burden?" Rowena's voice was sharp. "Or did you not trust us with it?" The question hung in the air like a blade, and Salazar felt the painful truth of it. Trust. Always it came back to trust. Even after all they'd shared, some part of him still held back, still prepared for betrayal, still protected his vulnerabilities. "Show us," Helga said gently. "Whatever you've discovered, we should all know. Secrets within secrets will only divide us." Salazar hesitated, then moved to a section of the cave they'd avoided by unspoken agreement, a shadowed alcove where the emotional resonance felt different, older, sadder. With a gesture that was part magic, part emotional projection, he revealed what he'd hidden there. Scrolls appeared, floating in the air like dark butterflies. Each one radiated wrongness, the emotional equivalent of nails on slate. These were the songs of destruction, pain transformed into weapon, fear shaped into chains, despair crafted into a poison that could kill from within. He'd learned them not by using them, but by understanding their inverse, like mapping darkness by studying light. "Salazar," Helga breathed, her face pale. "These are necessary," he said firmly. "If someone discovers the cave, if they learn to sing darkness, we need to know how to stop them. Every spell has a counterspell. Every poison has an antidote. These songs are no different." "But the temptation," Godric said, staring at the scrolls with a mixture of revulsion and fascination. "Knowing you could end any conflict with a projection of pure terror, knowing you could make anyone love you with the right emotional resonance." "Which is why I didn't want to burden you with the knowledge," Salazar said. "I've already paid the price of understanding these. I dream about them. I feel their potential every time I'm angry or hurt or afraid. It's like carrying poison in your veins and choosing, every moment, not to use it." Rowena approached the scrolls with the careful precision of a researcher handling dangerous specimens. "You've contained them well. The emotional barriers you've woven, they're brilliant. Painful to maintain, I imagine." "Everything about the songs is painful," Salazar admitted. "And wonderful. And terrible. And necessary." They stood in silence for a moment, absorbing this new knowledge, feeling the weight of it added to their already heavy burden. Then Helga did something unexpected. She began to sing, not a silent song, but an actual melody, wordless but beautiful, that seemed to wash the darkness from the cave. The scrolls dimmed, their wrongness muted though not erased. "My grandmother sang that to me," she said when she finished. "When I had nightmares. She said light doesn't defeat darkness by fighting it, but by being itself so brightly that darkness has nowhere to exist." "Pretty words," Salazar said, but not unkindly. "But darkness always returns when the light fades. Then we keep the light burning," Godric said with renewed determination. Together, they spent the rest of that session creating what they would later call the Concordat of Silence, a magical agreement that bound them together in purpose and protection. Using the emotional magic of the cave, they wove their intentions into something more binding than any oath, more permanent than any spell. They would guard the knowledge together. They would protect each other from its corruption. They would find a way to use it for good, or they would take it to their graves. The creation of the Concordat was exhausting. It required each of them to be completely emotionally honest about their fears, their temptations, their weaknesses. Godric admitted his fear that his courage was just disguised recklessness. Rowena confessed that her hunger for knowledge sometimes overwhelmed her ethics. Helga revealed her terror that her desire to help everyone would lead to helping no one. And Salazar finally spoke the truth he'd carried since childhood. "I'm afraid of being abandoned," he said, the words pulled from him by the Concordat's demand for honesty. "Every secret I keep, every wall I build, it's because I'm terrified that if you truly knew me, all of me, you'd leave. And I couldn't bear that. Not now. Not after knowing what it feels like to be truly understood." The cave rang with the power of that admission, and his three friends surrounded him, their emotional songs wrapping around him in a harmony of acceptance and love that made the 7 pillars blaze with light. "You impossible man," Rowena said through tears. "How could we leave you? You're part of us now. The songs have made sure of that. Even if we wanted to abandon you," Godric added with gruff affection, "which we couldn't. We're bound together by something stronger than magic now." "Family," Helga said simply. "That's what we are. Not just friends or colleagues, but family. And family doesn't abandon family, even when they're frustrating or secretive or convinced they're protecting everyone by suffering alone." The Concordat sealed itself with their combined emotional resonance, becoming a living thing that would exist as long as they did. They could feel it, a warm presence in their chests, a constant reminder of their bond and their burden. But even as they celebrated this deepening of their connection, cracks were forming in the wider foundation of Hogwarts. The other professors had begun to talk. Why did the founders disappear together so often? Why did they seem to know things they shouldn't know? Why had they become so insular, so separate from the rest of the staff? Rumors spread among the students too, wild tales of secret magic, of hidden chambers, of the founders discovering something they weren't sharing. The situation came to a head during the Feast of Samhain. The great hall was decorated with floating candles and autumn leaves that never fell, the tables groaning under the weight of the harvest feast. It should have been a joyous occasion, but the emotional atmosphere was tense, suspicious, almost hostile. Professor Aldrich had been drinking, not enough to be truly drunk, but enough to lower his careful inhibitions. He stood during the toasts, his goblet raised, and the emotional song that preceded his words told the founders exactly what was coming. "To our esteemed founders," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "May they remember that Hogwarts was built for all magical folk, not just for the 4 who happened to raise its walls." The hall went silent. Students looked between the professors, sensing adult conflict but not understanding its source. The other teachers shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke against Aldrich. His words had given voice to what many were feeling. Godric started to rise, his anger flaring hot enough that Salazar could feel it like standing too close to a forge. But Helga's hand on his arm stopped him, her emotional song of patience, wait, think cooling his rage. "You have something to say, Professor Aldrich?" Rowena's voice was calm, but Salazar could feel the hurt beneath it, the sting of accusation from someone they'd trusted. "We all have something to say," Aldrich replied, emboldened by the wine and the murmured support of his colleagues. Hogwarts was meant to be a collaboration, a unity of magical minds. But lately, it seems more like a kingdom with 4 monarchs who rule from secret chambers while the rest of us teach their subjects. "That's not," Godric began, but Aldrich continued. "You disappear for hours without explanation. You have private meetings that exclude the rest of the staff. You look at us like you know something we don't, like you're seeing through us." His voice grew harder. "What have you found? What are you hiding?" The emotional violence of the accusation was almost physical. Salazar saw Helga flinch, saw Rowena's knuckles whiten as she gripped her goblet, and he felt, from all 4 of them, the terrible temptation to respond with the truth, to let their emotional songs flood the hall, to make everyone feel what they felt, to force understanding through sheer emotional power. But that would be using the songs as weapons, exactly what they'd sworn never to do. "You're right," Salazar said, standing slowly. Every eye in the hall turned to him. The suspicious one, the secretive one, the one most likely to be hiding something. "We have been keeping something from you. Not from malice or arrogance, but from caution. We discovered something dangerous, something that required careful study before it could be shared safely." "Salazar," Rowena warned, but he continued. "We found a form of magic that predates wands and words," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's powerful, transformative, and incredibly dangerous if misused. We've been studying it, trying to understand it, trying to find a way to share it without risking catastrophe." "And you decided this without consulting us?" Professor Montague's voice was sharp with indignation. "You decided we weren't worthy of this knowledge?" "We decided you weren't ready," Godric said bluntly. "None of us were ready. It's taken us months to learn to control it, and we still struggle daily. Then show us, Aldrich demanded. If this magic is so dangerous, so powerful, prove it exists. The four founders looked at each other, a complete conversation passing in glances and emotional resonance. Then, as one, they decided. Very well, Rowena said. But not here. Not with the students present. Those who wish to understand, meet us in the antechamber after the feast. But know this, once you've seen what we've discovered, you can't unsee it. Once you've felt it, you can't unfeel it. It will change you permanently and irrevocably. The rest of the feast passed in tense silence. Students whispered among themselves, sensing historic moment, but not understanding its nature. The professors barely touched their food, anticipation and apprehension warring in the emotional atmosphere. When the students were finally dismissed to their dormitories, 17 professors gathered in the antechamber. Not the entire staff, but enough. Aldrich was there, of course, his skepticism worn like armor. Montague, ambitious and eager. Old Professor Dimmons, who'd taught at Hogwarts since the first day. Young Professor Clearwater, barely older than the 7th years, but brilliant with transfiguration. Before we begin, Helga said, her voice gentle but firm, we need your word that what you're about to experience will be kept secret until we all agree it's safe to share more widely. This isn't about power or exclusion. It's about protection, for you, for the students, for the very fabric of magical society. Some grumbled, but all eventually agreed. What choice did they have? The curiosity was killing them, and the emotional resonance of that curiosity was almost painful to the founders. Salazar stepped forward and, for the second time, consciously projected a silent song in front of those who couldn't yet hear them. But this time, he didn't project love or protection. Instead, he projected understanding, not his own understanding, but theirs. He took their curiosity, their frustration, their feeling of exclusion, and reflected it back at them, amplified and purified. The effect was immediate. Professor Aldrich gasped as he felt his own emotions return to him with crystal clarity, understanding for the first time how his resentment had been poisoning his teaching. Professor Montague tears as she experienced her ambition from an outside perspective, seeing how it had isolated her from her colleagues. One by one, each professor confronted their own emotional truth, unable to hide from it or rationalize it away. What is this? Dimmons whispered, his aged voice trembling. The beginning, Rowena said softly. This is just the surface of what we've discovered. The actual magic goes much deeper, requires much more. But you needed to understand, when you truly feel what others feel, when emotions become tangible and shareable, everything changes. It's beautiful, Clearwater said, wonder in her young voice. And terrifying. Precisely, Salazar agreed. Which is why we've been so careful. Which is why we needed time to understand it ourselves before sharing it with anyone. The demonstration had exhausted him, and he could feel similar fatigue from the other founders. Projecting to so many people at once, maintaining control, ensuring no one was hurt by the emotional intensity, it had pushed them to their limits. Can you teach us? Aldrich asked, and his emotional song had changed completely. The resentment was gone, replaced by awe and a little fear. Can we learn to do this? The founders exchanged glances again, and Salazar felt their collective uncertainty. They had planned for this moment, but now that it had arrived, the weight of decision was crushing. Some of you perhaps, Godric said finally. It requires a level of emotional honesty that many find impossible. It demands vulnerability, openness, the complete abandonment of protective facades. And it's dangerous, Salazar added. Not just difficult, but genuinely dangerous. People have died learning these songs. Others have gone mad. Still others have become monsters, using emotional manipulation to control and destroy. But you learned, Montague pointed out. The four of you mastered it. We had each other, Helga said simply. We learned together, protected each other, caught each other when we fell. Even so, there were close calls, times when one of us nearly lost themselves to the intensity of universal emotion. The professors absorbed this in silence, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd discovered. This wasn't just a new spell or a clever charm. This was a fundamental reimagining of magic itself. We need time to think, Dimmons said finally, speaking for the group. To discuss among ourselves, to decide if we're ready for such a transformation. Take all the time you need, Rowena said. But remember, absolute secrecy. The students must not know, not yet. Perhaps not ever. Children don't have the emotional maturity to handle this safely. The professors filed out, each lost in their own thoughts, their emotional songs a cacophony of excitement, fear, ambition, and doubt. The founders remained behind, exhausted and uncertain. "We've started something we can't stop," Salazar said quietly. "Perhaps," Godric agreed. "But at least we're not carrying the secret alone anymore." "The burden is shared," Rowena added, though she didn't sound entirely convinced it was a good thing. Helga said nothing, but her emotional song spoke of deep worry, of change coming whether they were ready or not. That night, alone in the cave, Salazar made a decision. The other professors might learn the beautiful songs, the healing songs, the songs of connection and understanding. But the dark songs, the weapons hidden in shadow, those would remain his burden alone. He created a second cache, deeper in the cave, protected by Parseltongue passwords and emotional barriers that would drive away anyone who didn't share his specific magical signature. Into this hidden vault, he placed not just the scrolls of destruction, but also his private journals, his detailed notes on every possible abuse of the emotional magic, his strategies for containing a disaster if one occurred. If the worst happened, if the songs were corrupted and turned to evil, someone would need this knowledge to stop it. And since he was already touched by the darkness of understanding these applications, better that he remain the sole keeper of this particular secret. He didn't tell the others. Another secret, another wall, another protection that was also a betrayal. But as he sealed the vault with magic that would last 1,000 years, he felt it was necessary. Some knowledge was too dangerous to be shared, even among family. Above, in the castle, students slept peacefully, unaware that their world had fundamentally changed. The professors who'd witnessed the demonstration lay awake, wrestling with the implications of what they'd experienced. And in their separate chambers, the four founders felt the weight of their success, which felt terribly like failure. They had shared the secret, but in doing so, had they simply spread the burden? Or had they planted seeds that would grow into something beautiful or terrible, depending on the hearts that nurtured them? Only time would tell. Epilogue, 1,000 years hence. Luna Lovegood hummed as she followed the pull of ancient magic through Hogwarts' rebuilt halls. The Battle of Hogwarts had ended 3 months ago, and while the visible damage had been repaired, she could feel deeper wounds in the castle's magical fabric, tears in the emotional tapestry that had been woven over centuries. It was these wounds that had led her to notice the songs. At first, she'd thought it was the Nargles, playing new music in her mind. But Nargles were mischievous, not melancholic, and these wordless melodies carried a weight of ages, a depth of feeling that no mere magical creature could produce. They were strongest in the dungeons, where the battle had been fiercest, where so much fear and courage and sacrifice had soaked into ancient stones. She'd been following the songs for 3 nights now, each time getting closer to their source. Tonight, she could feel it, just beyond this tapestry of serpents and badgers that had somehow survived the battle unscathed. The creatures in the weaving seemed to watch her approach, seemed almost to approve. "Hello, ancient friends," she said to them in her dreamy voice. "I can hear your secret. Would you like to share it with someone who already knows how to listen to things others can't hear?" The tapestry shimmered, and behind it, the wall opened with a sigh of recognition. Luna descended through the phosphorescent passage without fear. Fear was for people who didn't trust the universe to unfold as it should, and Luna had always trusted. The moss light guided her, and she could smell wild honey and pine, though neither should exist so far underground. When she emerged into the cave, she laughed with pure delight. "Oh, you're beautiful," she said to the space, to the pillars, to the pool of impossible stars. "You're all the feelings that ever were, aren't you? All the songs people sang without knowing they were singing." The cave responded to her emotional openness with a gentle resonance, like a parent recognizing a child who'd been long away. Luna knelt by the pool and saw not her reflection but the truth, thousands of emotional echoes, accumulated over centuries, waiting for someone who could hear them without fear. She didn't need instruction. Luna had always felt others' emotions, had always seen the rack spurts of confusion and the bright butterflies of joy that most people didn't notice. The cave simply amplified what she'd always been able to do, gave form to what she'd always known existed. The first song that came to her was one of reunion, all the desperate relief of friends finding each other alive after the battle, all the joy of families reunited, all the bittersweet return to a home forever changed. She let it flow through her, and the cave filled with silver light that felt like Harry's laughter, like Neville's quiet strength, like all the DA members finding their way back to each other. But there was more. As she explored the cave, she found the ancient inscriptions, the warnings and hopes of those who'd come before. And in a corner that felt older and sadder than the rest, she discovered Salazar's hidden vault. It should have been impossible to open. The Parseltongue passwords should have been insurmountable. But Luna didn't try to break the barriers. Instead, she simply felt the emotion that had created them, the terrible loneliness of carrying dangerous knowledge, the desperate desire to protect others from darkness, the love that manifests as distance. "You were so lonely," she said softly to the long-dead founder. "You thought keeping secrets would keep them safe. But secrets are like gulping plimpies. The more you try to contain them, the more they expand until they burst." The vault opened, not because she'd overcome its protections, but because she'd understood them. Inside were the dark songs, the weapons Salazar had hidden. Luna looked at them with the same serene acceptance she brought to all things. "Every garden needs compost," she said philosophically. "Dead things feeding new growth. Dark emotions becoming wisdom through understanding." She didn't take the scrolls or try to use the dark songs. Instead, she sang to them, not a silent song but a verbal one, a lullaby her mother had sung before she died. The dark knowledge didn't disappear, but it transformed, becoming not temptation but teaching, not weapon but warning. When she emerged from the cave hours later, dawn was breaking over the Scottish Highlands. The castle looked different to her now, not just rebuilt stone and mortar, but a living thing woven from centuries of emotion. Every portrait, every staircase, every common room hummed with the accumulated feelings of thousands of students and teachers. Professor McGonagall was waiting for her in the entrance hall, because of course she was. The headmistress had developed an uncanny ability to know when students were doing something significant. "Miss Lovegood," she said in her stern voice that couldn't quite hide the fondness underneath, "would you care to explain where you've been?" "I've been learning to sing, Professor," Luna replied dreamily. "The founders left us their music, but we forgot how to hear it. The battle woke it up again, all that emotion, all that truth. The castle is ready to teach us what we forgot." McGonagall studied her for a long moment, and Luna could feel the older witch's emotional song. Strength forged in loss, determination tempered by wisdom, and underneath it all, a deep love for the school and all who dwelt within it. "Show me," McGonagall said simply. So Luna did. She projected just a whisper of what she'd learned, the gentlest touch of emotional magic, the feeling of Hogwarts itself, ancient and patient and eternally young, welcoming its children home. McGonagall's eyes widened, then filled with tears she would never admit to shedding. "The founders?" "All four of them," Luna confirmed. "They found something beautiful and terrible and necessary. They tried to protect us from it, but I think we're ready now. After everything we've faced, everything we've lost and found and fought for, we're ready to truly understand each other." Over the following weeks, Luna quietly shared her discovery with those she felt were ready. Not everyone. The emotional magic was still dangerous for the unprepared or ill-intentioned. But those who had fought in the battle, who had faced death and chosen love, who had sacrificed and survived, they could handle the truth. Harry learned to project the protective love that had saved him so many times, creating shields that no dark magic could penetrate. Hermione discovered she could share complete understanding, transferring not just knowledge but wisdom. Ron found that his emotional loyalty could literally strengthen others, giving them courage they didn't know they possessed. Neville's deep connection to growing things became a song that could heal both land and hearts. And in the dungeons, where Slytherin House was rebuilding its reputation and identity, a strange thing happened. The portrait of Salazar Slytherin, which had been silent for centuries, began to speak. Not words, but emotions, regret for divisions created, hope for unity restored, and deepest of all, the wish that his house's children would no longer bear the burden of his fears. The emotional magic spread slowly, carefully, naturally through the rebuilt Hogwarts. Not as formal lessons, but as understanding passed from friend to friend, from teacher to student, from one heart to another. Some heard the songs clearly, like Luna. Others simply felt more connected, more understood, more part of the magical whole. And deep in the cave of first silence, the pool of impossible stars reflected a new pattern, one of healing, of reunion, of ancient wounds finally beginning to close. The four founders' dream of unity, delayed by 1,000 years of fear and division, was finally, tentatively, beginning to bloom. The keeper of silent songs had become the sharer of silent songs, and in that sharing, the world was changing. Not through force or conquest, but through the simple, revolutionary act of truly feeling what others felt. The emotional magic that had once threatened to divide was becoming the bridge that would unite. In the Scottish Highlands, as mist rolled over the mountains and the sun set behind ancient peaks, Hogwarts sang with 1,000 voices in perfect harmony, a song without words that spoke of hope, of healing, of home. The silence had found its voice at last.